and the session is being recorded as of now. Our chapter is quite lucky to have Brett with us today. Brett is the owner and principal consultant of Workplace Performance Consulting, which he began in 2016. He has worked with the Canadian Department of National Defence as one of his prime clients. He's conducted occupational analysis for their military police, as well as a needs assessment of the Canadian Forces Individual Training and Education System, also known as CFITES. This encompasses their entire military training system as a whole. For more information about his firm, visit workplaceperformanceblog.wordpress.com. And if you go there now, you'll get to see his latest blog post in which he is celebrating Talk Like a Pirate Day. Arr. Brett, the microphone is all yours.
Thanks very much, Max. Thanks, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today to do this presentation for you. So we'll get right into it. So here's the objectives. We're going to look at the performance improvement process model, which is a model I've been working on for the last few years. I'm going to share some stories about the 5 major steps of that model in order for you to be able to share those stories with colleagues, friends, and neighbors that will hopefully inform and entertain them. Throughout the presentation, I'll be connecting the 5 main steps and the stories to ISPI's 10 standards. So first off, we're going to have a little poll to see what the experience level is with the audience with performance improvement. And Max is going to launch that for, oh, there it is. That's better than some presentations I've done where people don't know what it is. So it's good we got more people using it. And for those that know what it is but haven't applied it, I'm hoping that by the end of this session, you'll have a roadmap for how you can use it in your work. Okay, so that poll's closed. And now we're going to do one more poll on the 10 standards. Always curious to see who knows what the 10 standards are and if they use them. Okay, so for pretty much everybody, they know what they are and they use them to guide their work. That's excellent. A little note here, you'll see in the list of the 10 standards that there's a plus. That's not actually listed in the 10 standards by ISPI. That was developed by Roger Addison. And the plus means to remain solution neutral. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Oh, Max, did everybody get the handout ahead of time?
We had Jet publish that on our details for the presentation. So everybody who registered should have had a chance to look at that. Those who have registered before we put it up, we can make that available to them later, or you can choose to show that now.
Okay, perfect. So there is a handout that's available. You may have had it. If not, you can go and get it later. So the first 4 of the 10 standards are the principles, and they're often referred to as RSVP. So results, being systemic, adding value, and working in partnership with clients. And then there's that plus that I just mentioned on the last slide about remaining solution neutral. That's not in your handout, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. The remainder of the standards are the systematic process that we use as performance consultants. The first 3 of those, standards 5, 6, and 7, are needs analysis, cause analysis, and designing the solutions. And then the last 3, 8, 9, and 10, are ensuring solutions conformity and feasibility, implementation, and measuring the results. So this is the performance improvement process model. This is what it looked like when we presented it at the ISPI conference in 2019. It's gone through some very significant changes based on feedback from people who saw it at the conference, people who looked at it in the article I published in the Performance Improvement Journal, and just other friends and colleagues who've looked at it and said, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? So this was it then, and you can see on the right here is the new model, which is what we're going to look at today. So you can see there's been some pretty significant changes. So here it is in full. We're going to work through it quickly together, and then I'm going to share some stories that relate to the 5 steps. So change management, project management, and formative evaluation are the 3 activities that occur throughout the process. Project management is generally more involved at the beginning of the project, and once the interventions are selected, change management really kicks into gear. Formative evaluation is occurring throughout the process because we should be deliberately circling back to engage stakeholders in each step to ensure that we're on the right track, and we should be revisiting the organizational goals to confirm that what we are doing is going to close the gap and improve performance. So that was the first big change, was the addition of those 3 foundational aspects. And I got that idea from Van Team's HPT model, where they had circled the model with change management. Okay, so step 1 is needs assessment and needs analysis. This is probably why some people end up crying in their projects, because this step gets skipped a lot when people don't know about performance improvement. The standards related to this step are 1 through 4, or 1 through 5. Standards 1 through 4, the principles are in orange because they apply to everything we do in every step in performance improvement, no matter which model you're using. Standard 5, if you recall, is determining the need or the opportunity, and that's why it's all included in step 1. So the changes from the previous version, we just added the wording based on current organizational requirements under the want or need. We changed mega, macro, and micro under the needs assessment and the gaps into the 4 W's of worker, work, workplace, and world. Because if you know Roger Kaufman's work, mega comes from his work, and you really need to know his work to understand what it means. Whereas worker, world, workplace, and work are generally more understandable and accessible to people outside of the field. So that's why we changed that. Step 2, after you've determined that the problem is worth fixing in step 1, this is where we figure out what's really going on. Often people come to us with a symptom describing that as the cause of the problem. I have a great story for this later, but first we'll finish going through the model. So this covers standard 6, determine the cause. During this step, we look back to the organizational goals and we make sure that everything is still aligned. Quite often, there's a need to improve on the way the goals are stated, and part of the materials that were shared was an article by Peter Honebein, one of my colleagues at Boise State, on how to write requirements. So if you're not sure how to do that, I'd highly recommend you reading that article. It's exceptional. Then we decide if training is part of the answer. If training and non-training interventions are used, they have to be integrated. It's not binary. You can't do training in isolation from non-training. They should be developed together. You can see down at the bottom in the orange, these are the things that were added to the new model. So cost benefit analysis and writing a business case were things that didn't exist in the old model, but are things that we should be doing, especially for larger interventions, because you need to clearly lay out for your client what it is that you're going to do, how much it's going to cost, whether you're going to buy, build, or modify, and then you put that all into a business case and you get them to approve it before you get into the design work. Step 3, design and develop. The intervention is the next piece. So we design solutions that should include implementation and evaluation and ensure the solution's conformity and feasibility. So changes from the previous version of the model, standards. Standards 7 and 8 from the model apply here, and the changes from the previous version is the addition of defining the user requirements, writing the performance objectives, which we didn't specify in the old version, and identifying metrics. And we didn't actually have a step for developing interventions in the old model, so we put that in as well. You'll note down here between the training intervention and non-training intervention box, there's that little dotted line, and that's again just to demonstrate that the two need to be considered together. Step 4 is implementation. That's where the rubber hits the road. Like Nike says, just do it. If you've done everything right, this should be the fun part. However, a common saying in the military is your plan will only survive until first contact with the enemy. And that means that no matter how well you plan, there will be something that wasn't thought of and you will need to deal with. So be prepared to adjust. I just noticed in the chat that Steve asked Pete Honebein's article. Is that what I mean? Absolutely. That's the article I'm talking about. So the standards for here are standard 9, and the changes from the old model are plan, implementation, and implement. It's all new. And finally, we get to step 5, measure. Performance isn't improved until we can measure and show the impact of the change. The worst case scenario is nothing has changed or it got worse, and then we might have to start again. The worst case scenario is the client doesn't even want you or have the resources to measure. And sadly, this is common. I have lots of clients that aren't interested in measuring the change. It's important to always have that discussion with them though. And if you can, you should do the measurement anyway, because you want to be able to show the value that you've created for your client. So the change here is that infinity symbol between measure performance and the outcome. And the reason I added that is because we should always be measuring. Okay, so the remainder of so that's the model. The remainder of our time together, we're going to share some stories related to each of the 5 steps. And there should be some time at the end if you've got questions. So Karen, oh, hi Karen. How can you collapse these steps for senior managers with short attention spans who don't like a wall of text? Well, one of the best ways is to tell a great story, and so I'm going to share some of those shortly. And I would suggest that even though the model looks pretty complicated when you first throw it up, that if you can walk them through it, it's actually pretty simple. And we'll see what you think about that at the end of the presentation, and if that would work. And if not, maybe we can talk some more about that. And maybe others have other strategies. Okay, so the first story is around step number 1, needs assessment, needs analysis. And so that's that part of the model up on the screen. So this is one of the sad stories. Last year I billed the Canadian government over $15,000 Canadian, so that I think that works out to about $5,000 US for a course to fix a performance problem. Why did we choose a course? Well, we didn't choose the course. My client was told by their senior manager to build a course to fix what was his perceived problem. So the point here is that the client almost always comes in solution oriented, and this is my key message for the first step in the model. The plus in RSVP, plus remain solution neutral, is critical. And so remember, it's not published as part of the ISPI standards, so you might want to just add that into your list. So the characters in this story are me as the consultant and two groups of people I'll call the wizards and the jocks. The problem was that the client needed to increase coordination on exercise planning to increase the quality of the events and reduce cost, which was being driven by short notice reaction to poor planning and preparation. So the wizards, who are modeling and simulation experts, aren't being asked to participate in the exercise planning until far too late. So what should be happening is there should be higher collaboration right at the start of the exercise planning process. The desired outcome or results was a synchronized plan that resulted in significantly lower costs for exercise execution. And we're talking multi-million-dollar exercises. So to explain a little bit about what happened, I got asked to come in and build this course. I met with the stakeholders, which were the two groups, the wizards and the jocks. I collected some resource material, essentially the wizards' processes and the jocks' processes. And I went back to my office and I sat down and I looked through it all and realized that modeling and simulation, the wizards' stuff, was not discussed at all in the exercise planning process document, which was owned by the jocks. So I convened another meeting, sat down with the two groups, and explained that the lack of inclusion of modeling and simulation in the exercise design process was more likely the root cause, and training would not fix that because people would be trained and the process wouldn't change. Unfortunately, I was told that they didn't have money to change the process. They just wanted a course. So I built the course, the training was delivered, the process remained the same, and unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier about measurement, I didn't get to measure if there was any change in the results of the exercise planning. So not sure if performance improved at all as a result of that. So that's a sad story. So in step 2, we're looking for causes versus symptoms. And symptoms are usually obvious acute issues which anyone can see and everyone agrees on. Some examples of symptoms include rising absenteeism, low or no sales growth, underperforming staff, shrinking margins. These are all examples. So when we identify a root cause, we should look at the organizational requirements, which is a clear statement of the capability or performance a solution should possess. Quite often when you're working with a client, you'll find out that that the requirements aren't written in a way that are traceable, measurable, and actionable. So using Honebind's method, you can help the client rewrite those organizational requirements so that it will be clearly understood by all the stakeholders in the organization. And I'll leave it to you to read the article to go into the process about that. It's at this point in the process that we want to start thinking about change management, which is the action or process taken to smoothly transition from the current state to the desired future state. And again, as we move into the intervention analysis, we want to keep in mind that plus in the RSVP plus, where we're solution neutral. In Van Teem's book, The Fundamentals of Performance Improvement, she talks about how an accountant will give an accounting intervention, and lots of people have experienced where an instructional system designer will give a training intervention. We, being performance consultants, we want to avoid that and provide the best interventions to solve the root cause problems, or the root causes of the problems. So in the analysis, we start with the business requirement. We identify the criteria and the metrics to evaluate the results, performance goals and performance objectives for each element of the intervention. These come out of the business requirement. We identify the potential interventions, and if you want a great list of potential interventions, that book by Van Teem, The Fundamentals of Performance Improvement, is a fantastic resource. There's pages and pages and pages. Then we make the decision on purchasing, developing, or modifying existing elements, which relates to the feasibility standard. We can compare that back to the 6 boxes from Gilbert, and we can look at if there's any performance barriers that will prevent the intervention from being successful. And a good tool to use to do that is Lewin's force field analysis. Steve asked if engagement is a symptom. I would say yes, because engagement is a behavior, and we would be looking for why there is a lower level of engagement, which is probably going to come from something in the way the environment is designed, and that would probably get us to the root cause. Back to the analysis. So once we've made that decision on purchase, develop, or modify, we also want to start thinking about change management. If you haven't started thinking about it, you need to start thinking about it now. So then we're looking at selection of the interventions. Remember that this step is collaborative. You need to gain the support of the champion, which is the sponsor, and also of all the stakeholders. A good strategy is to include the stakeholders in the selection of the interventions to increase buy-in. Excuse me. And we also want to think about prioritization factors. So we've got the sponsorship buy-in. There's an acronym called MAD, which refers to money, ability, and desire. You can measure your potential interventions against that. You can look at ROI and long versus short-term effectiveness, the institutionalization and sustainability of the interventions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the one of our stories. So that's step 2. And our story about this is related to a 24/7 call center for the Royal Canadian Military Police in Canada. And just, I got to give credit to my pal Sean Ray, who quite often co-presents this with me. He's not here today, but the stories about the RCMP come from Sean and his experiences. So this call center or dispatch center was run by a regular force police officer, but manned by civilians. So first thing is we have 2 different backgrounds. The police officer has a different understanding of how things work than the civilians. And the supervising officer rotates in and out regularly while the civilians are there all the time. After the call center was established and was working for a while, the performance dropped. So the police officer in charge asked for a course on multitasking. This is a complicated job. There's each operator has several monitors and multiple keyboards. They have to deal with internal communications while handling the 911 call from the caller, and then there's other external communications where they're talking to the different emergency services, whether it be, fire, paramedic, police, etc. So pretty complicated job for these guys. Some of the symptoms that were shown were rising absenteeism and increasing overtime costs. So the consultant, my friend Sean, asked to go see the call center in action, and they interviewed the operators. And what they discovered was it wasn't the ability to multitask, it was actually the work environment. So when the call center was designed, standard office chairs were purchased, which weren't suitable for the 24/7 use. The chairs were breaking down. There was one chair they saw that had a phone book propped up underneath to replace a missing wheel. This was leading to back issues. So ergonomics, which is one of the things that we always want to consider. Motivation was down as well. And one of the reasons for this was the cleaning staff that took care of the facility were contracted for a 8 to 4 or Monday to Friday contract, but the operations were 24/7. So you can imagine the mess in the facility by Monday morning when it hadn't been cleaned for a couple days. So what they did was they fixed the chairs, they changed the cleaning schedule to a 24/7, and performance improved with no training whatsoever. So a real happy story. Now that we're finished that step, I'll jump back to the chat here, and Michael asked if there's a copy of this flow chart. There absolutely is. And in the handout that's being provided, there's the 10 standards on one side and a paper copy of the whole performance improvement process model on the other side. Okay, so let's go to the next step, step 3, which is select and design and develop the interventions. So first thing we're doing here is creating a design plan and getting going. Of course, sorry, I'm going to just step back to this one. So recall here that we've done a cost benefit analysis. We've written a business case when it's required, and we have a sponsorship approval to make sure that before we jump into the design phase, we're going to have everything that we need to put this into place successfully. Sorry, I was just reading the chat. Okay, so the story that goes along with the design phase here is another one from Sean, and this is a story about field coaches for the RCMP. So the RCMP wanted to implement a coaching program for officers in the field. Engaging stakeholders early on was really important in this project. When the RCMP officers graduate from their school, which is called Training Depot, and go to their first post, they are assigned a field coach. So the program was in place, but the thing missing was there was no training for the coaches. So the RCMP wanted to strengthen the coach's ability to support the new graduates from Training Depot. The business requirements that Sean received asked for a Cadillac program as a result of a less than glowing report from Canada's Auditor General about the program. So the big question was, can the organization sustain this Cadillac program over the long term? And Sean and his team went back to the stakeholders and raised this and explained, that the whole business case piece of it and how much extra funding was going to be required. So extra funding was obtained, a train the trainer program was established, and the coaching training was rolled out. It wasn't just training, however. One of the performance improvement aspects included developing performance measures for the officers and the coaches. So recall earlier I said that it's not binary, that there's often training and non-training interventions, and they have to be integrated. So this is a great example of that. And that's the end of that story. So we're going to go back to chat. Steve's given us some great examples about clients asking for solutions that perceived magical solutions. And Karen has said, I discovered that in Canada, the only field close to performance technology, its processes or methods, is business analysis. But nearly all BA roads lead to IT solutions. Solution biased, one trick ponies. Thoughts? Karen, that's a fantastic observation. And I have a real trouble with business analyst. Really, in my experience looking at contracts that are put out for that, it really is IT based, and it's taking on a very niche focus in I guess process engineering for IT based processes seems to be where it's been heading. So I don't list myself as a business analyst. I list myself as a management consultant. And generally the business analyst stuff is stuff I shy away from because it really is just about IT, which is unfortunate because business is so much more than IT. Okay, so we're going to go on to step 4, which is planning the implementation of the project, and then, or planning the implementation of the interventions and then implementing them. So these relate to standard 9. And a little note here, if you're starting change management now, it's too late. So again, we want to start that much earlier in the process. Again, we'll just go over the standards. Standard 1, partnering, networking, and alliance building. Standard 2, I'm sorry, this is not standard 2. We want to think about process consulting as required. We want to think about employee development, communication, and we're definitely applying the project management principles here. Project management's pretty heavy here when we're trying to get things all into place. So this is another RCMP story from Sean, and it relates back to the last story. Based on the success of the field coaching program, the RCMP moved into training of frontline supervisors. The aim was to teach the frontline supervisors about performance improvement as a tool to help them increase employee performance. So a proposal was created, a business case was written, and senior management approved the plan and the funding. Year 1 went really well, but this was funded using something in the military, we call it opportunity funds. So it's short-term money that is available within the finances for that fiscal year. It's not capitalized funding that is planned over a longer term. The RCMP finance folks weren't informed that they needed to add this training as a programmatic cost going forward, and then to further complicate it, there was a change in government, so we went from a liberal to a conservative government, and a change in priorities occurred, and budgets got cut. So the provincial governments stepped in to help with the funding shortfall, but the result was that the control of the intervention design was lost, and the program got watered down, and a lot of the performance improvement aspects were removed, and what had originally started as a Cadillac became more of a Kia. The program faltered as it lost organizational support. So the key here to this story is that you have to remember that after it's implemented, you need to maintain it. So the RCMP's biggest problem in the Bridging the Gap project was no long-term support. Everybody loved it. Nobody wanted to pay for it. And so partway through year 2, it faltered and it got shut down. Sad story. So our final step is measurement. And this relates to standard 10 measure. This is one of my stories. So the big bang of this story is finishing projects at half the price in a shorter time frame using internal resources rather than sending the work out to contract service providers like myself now. So the main point here is you got to measure before you call the project finished. If you don't, guaranteed someone out there will be wondering if it was worth the time and effort. So you need to learn, you need to do all the calculations and show your client the result. If it was a bad result, be transparent, learn from it, and fix it. Because we're all professionals, I have no doubt that our results are going to be amazing. So act 1 in this story, the characters, there's me, there's a team of 3 e-learning developers who we'll call the geeks. There was my boss, who we'll call the pessimist. There were some contractors, the gold-plated caddy driving e-learning experts. I drive a Honda. Doesn't mean I'm not an expert, but I don't drive a caddy. So the problem in this situation was we needed to reduce the time and cost to complete e-learning projects while maintaining the expected level of quality. If we don't achieve this, the unit that I was working in was going to be shut down. So rather than, I'm not going to go through the whole story because we don't have a ton of time, but the end result of the project when we were all done and we had applied some instructional systems design processes, some project management processes, and a whole bunch of communication about standards. Once it was all done, I was able to walk into my boss, the pessimist's office, and say, hey, we did it. We did 2 major projects that were both completed in under 6 months and under budget. So she looked over her horn-rimmed glasses and said, yeah, outsourcing it would still be cheaper and faster. And I realized as she said that I had nothing to prove her wrong. So while I had measured our results internally, I hadn't measured against what an external consultant would do. So I left the report on her desk and said, I'm pretty sure that they can't, but I'm going to have to go back and find a way to prove it to you. So what we did was we made up a request for proposals for a similar project. And so these were e-learning projects to replace classroom training. They were 40 hours in length, so like a full week of training. So these were pretty significant projects and covered a mountain of content. So we put out an RFP for similar requirements to 3 big defense contractors that provided e-learning support. And all 3 came back with longer timelines and higher costs than what we had done. So then I was able to go back to the boss and say, you know, here's the proof. We can do this faster and cheaper while maintaining that level of quality. And to prove the level of quality, we submitted one of those 2 projects that we had done to the Canadian Society for Training Development for their awards program, and it won a gold award for e-learning. So we were showing that we were hitting at the top level of quality in the industry. There's an example of measurement. Before we leave that topic and go into some questions, I want to talk about when results are not improved. So when results aren't improved, we need to take a really hard look at what happened. And in an example where my colleague Sean had done an intervention with an RCMP investigative unit that took about 18 months. After the implementation, they measured performance and there was no change in investigative skills. So the performance remained constant, it didn't improve. So Sean was kind of puzzled by that, and so they went back to look at why. And after some analysis, they realized that during that 18-month period, half of the unit had rotated out and new investigators were brought in, which in the past would have caused a significant drop in performance until the new folks were brought up to speed on the investigative processes. So in this case, the historic dip didn't happen, and there was an improvement by the removal of that dip. So lots of different ways to look at things. And this also highlights the need for measuring continually so that you can identify trends. And that's why we added that, the infinity symbol there after measure performance. So that's it for evaluate. And now we're going to open it up for a little discussion. I've been watching the chat window out of my right eye and seeing it moving up. So we'll have a look there. So we've talked about the business analysts. Are there any success stories to compare and contrast? We've given a couple success stories. Steve asks, have you thought about adding a maintenance section to your model? It seems to be left out a lot of our PI models, and that is a great point. So where's my post-it notes? I will, I'll have a look at that. Aaron said, collapsing steps in lean and internal work, classic government. Thankfully, we're engaging support for management consultants and evaluation PhDs. And so with respect to collapsing steps, if we go ahead to this screen and we just look at the overall model, you can see, you know, my goal is to try and keep it on one page and someday write a book about it, where I will go into much more detail in each of the steps. You know, there's a challenge between what to include in the model and then what to leave out for further explanation elsewhere. This is really meant to be put it up on a whiteboard or on, you know, in your cubicle, and just use it as a guide to help you execute your practice. Ann Scott asked if we could provide the name of the article about writing requirements again. And I did not write down the exact name of the article, but it's about writing business requirements by Honebine, and it should be in the resources that were provided to you on registration. So I'm going to jump back to the last slide here and kind of put the dots together. So we've talked about the 5 main steps of the performance improvement process model. We've given some stories for each of the 5 major steps, and you'll notice that I've said 5 steps, but really in a few of them there's really 2 major steps, and maybe as I continue to improve it, we'll look at breaking it down into more steps. And then we've connected everything back to ISPI's 10 standards. So we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left if anybody would like to ask questions. Max, I don't know if you want to let people use their microphone so we can talk, because it's easier than the chat, or you can certainly chat your question into the chat window if you'd like.
Yeah, at this point, everyone in attendance, you know, feel free to chime in with your microphone. We seem to think that'll be easier, so you're absolutely free to do so.
Karen's asked, while you get your microphones and your questions ready, Karen's asked, how do you draw attention for senior managers to employee motivation incentives for org change and improvement opportunities? And if you notice in the chat window, Max has put the title of the article in there. Thanks very much for that, Max. So one of the things I do when trying to make senior managers understand is I refer back to Gilbert's behavior engineering model, simply because it's simple and it shows it shows the division between the environment and the individual, and how if we can properly engineer the environment, which is a management responsibility, that generally motivation takes care of it itself. So that's kind of my strategy. We'll open it up now. Does anybody else have anything they want to share about that, or have a question that they want to ask? And Karen's mentioned a BEM iPhone app, which I haven't heard of. I'm not an iPhone user. And now I'm wondering if there's a Android iPhone app, or sorry, an Android app for the BEM. Karen, maybe you could share a link to that in the chat for everybody. That's fantastic, because I had no idea that existed. So V. Singleton asks, how does Thomas Gilbert's behavior engineering model fit into this, or does it? So Gilbert's behavior engineering model is a cause analysis model, and so that would be applied during step 2. And one of the things I like to tell my students at Boise or other consultants is that one of the biggest strengths that we bring to the work that we do is knowing which models to apply at which time. So that's a great one, Gilbert's behavior engineering model. I use it almost mentally now whenever I'm discussing issues with a client. I'm kind of running what they're telling me through the BEM in my head, and quite often I find that there's lots of issues in the information and resources boxes, the first 2 boxes in the environment. And of course, you know, there's other tools that we can use to pair with Gilbert's. A good one is the Ishikawa's fishbone diagram. So you can take the BEM categories or other categories and put them up there on the fishbone diagram. And then it's easy to visualize it for your client where the problems are coming from. Oh, it's from Innovative Learning Group. Great. Thanks, Karen, for sharing that. So everybody, there's a link in there for the BEM phone app. I'm going to go there and click that so it opens in my browser, so I don't lose it when we close the presentation. So I hope that answers about Gilbert's model and how it fits in. Any other questions that you want to talk about? Steve tends to morph.
I personally have a question, and I'll go ahead and chime in via microphone because I'm just not as fast as a typer as I'd like to be. Regarding the performance improvement process model, it's really well thought out. And as a practitioner of HPI myself with my own firm, I refer to this pretty often. I find it immensely helpful to explain to people what I do. I noticed going through it that it's hard for me to tell exactly where step 1 ends and step 2 begins, and so on and so forth. Have you ever considered breaking up those specific regions of the model with various colors or numeric sequence to indicate that?
I have not. Not to say that I wouldn't consider it in version 11, because this is version 10. And really, this is why I keep presenting it, because I keep getting great feedback on how to improve it. And I don't know if it'll ever be done. Part of the challenge with this, and like I said earlier, in a in an earlier presentation, probably a couple of years back, we kind of carved it up into 5 steps. And with this latest iteration of it, I've had to combine what I would consider individual steps together. So cause analysis, I think, is a step on its own, and intervention selection, I think, is a step on its own. So, you know, going forward, there may be more steps or not. Part of the challenge is because our process is iterative, and remember, you know, one of those in the RSVP that we're continually checking back with our stakeholders. And this also relates to the formative evaluation. When you do the intervention selection, for example, and you come up with 7 different interventions that have the potential to improve performance, you're probably not going to implement all 7. You're probably going to pick the top 2 or 3 that that have the highest potential and probably the lowest cost, and then leave the rest for later. So so when you do that, you may end up going back during the design phase after discovering that one of the 3 that you've selected isn't going to work for a reason you hadn't anticipated, and then you need to go back and talk to the stakeholders and say, well, you know, intervention number 2 is not going to work because the technology is too expensive. We didn't anticipate that, and we're going to recommend that we go with number 4 instead. So it's iterative. It's hard to carve it up into specific steps. I do that more for ease of presentation. You need to consider the model as a whole, because we're being systemic and systematic in our practices. But I like everybody's recommendations about that, and I'll have a look at that. So John asked, how do we get a copy of the most current model? The one I presented today is the most current model, and I'm just gonna click here. You can download a copy of it at my blog, and there's a paper copy provided in your in the resources that were provided by the chapter. So you can download that and print it as well. So there's 2 ways to get it. Any other questions? Have I thought about scalability? Absolutely. So it's covered a little bit by the blog address, but so beside needs assessment and behind the gaps, maybe I'll scroll back to here. So you can see here, beside needs assessment and behind the gaps, we look at it from the perspective of worker, work, workplace, and world. So we're trying to think about all 4 levels of the organization at all times. And now Steve has further clarified, can this model be used for big and small projects alike? And I would say absolutely. Sometimes a needs assessment can be done, you know, in a 3-hour sit-down discussion with a client around a kitchen table. And an example of that is I helped a colleague work with one of her clients who owned a small business, and we basically did the needs assessment process in a morning over coffee, and came up with a number of recommendations to help her streamline her business. I've also done a needs assessment for, as Max mentioned earlier, I did a needs assessment of the Canadian Forces individual training and education system, which was a 6-month process involving surveys and travel across the country and a ton of analysis of different aspects of that system, because the Army, Navy, and Air Force all have their own individual training and education systems that are different from the pan military one. So that was a much bigger project, and you know, it was 6 months just to get to a series of recommendations. And so Steve has shared that he agrees with that, and that his shortest needs assessment was about 15 minutes, and his longest at DLS group was about 7 months. So, and of course, that's just the needs assessment. And again, so the client that I had helped my colleague with, you know, we went through the needs assessment and did some intervention recommendations. I didn't work through the entire process because you know, design, development, implementation, and measurement was all left to my colleague. So I don't know exactly what happened with that. Certainly, if it had been my project, I would have worked through that whole process to get, you know, to how are we going to measure this. Not sure what happened with that. So there you go. We got about 2 minutes left, I think. If anybody else has any questions, concerns, observations. Today's attention deficit C-suite would benefit from a model you can draft on a cocktail napkin, like the BEM. It's very true. I'm attention deficit too. I like things that are simple. I would caution about the BEM though, Karen, just because it really is, you know, it's just a cause analysis model. Part of the challenge, I think, with consultants is because we understand the whole process, we tend to mentally leap from the BEM and work through the process, you know, in our minds. So it may not be as straightforward to somebody who's outside of the field. So Karen said it misses a number of things, but simplifies to get people's attention. Org culture considerations are lost for sure. Absolutely. And agree wholly that that it's a great place to start the discussion with. Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so to respect everybody's time, I think I'm going to turn it back to Max to wrap it up. If anybody has anything else that they want to do. Oh, hi, George. Good to see you on here. If anybody else has anything they want to discuss, I can stay online for a few minutes afterwards. Up to you. Over to you, Max. Thanks very much, everybody.
Hey, thank you so much for your time today, Brett. And I want to say thank you, everybody, for making the time to attend this presentation. It's obviously worth the price of admission. I think everybody can agree to that. It's been a pleasure to facilitate this today. So what we'll go ahead and do is get this recording wrapped up, encoded, and put up onto our ISPI BABS website for your use and others. And what I'd like to do is just kind of run this by everybody. If you can just give me a quick response in the chat. I want to make sure everybody's had the opportunity to get the resources that Brett has mentioned throughout his presentation here, because I hear some cases of like Steve got access to the article, but maybe some other people didn't. And I want to make sure everybody gets that. So I can use some of our systems on the back end to email everybody who registered for this event today. If you'd like me to do that, I can shoot you out copies of everything that Brett had referenced. Just go ahead and let me know in the chat if that sounds okay to you. Okay, yeah, so even here, we're still getting some kind of mixed responses in there too. Okay, because I do want to make sure everybody gets those. So what I'll go ahead and do is send those out to everybody directly into your inbox for the email that you used to register for this event. Go ahead and check there. Please feel free to delete it if you don't need it, but that way we can make sure everybody gets it. Brett, again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you everybody for being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks again, everyone.